So we're continuing our Motown Matrimonies and More series. As you'll remember last week, we kicked it off by discussing the love stories of founder of Motown, Berry Gordy. So now, naturally, we need to dive into all things Supremes. These women inspired the hit Broadway play and award-winning movie Dreamgirls. Yes, we're reflecting on the lives of the original three, Diana Ross, Mary Wilson, and Florence Ballard. But honestly, their love stories are intimately intertwined with their time as Supremes and beyond. They were all drawn to men who saw them outside of what they were to the rest of the world, but how their respective relationships took form varied. Soon, you'll see. And honestly, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we're going to be discussing a lot of very heavy and sensitive topics, so if you are around children or if certain topics make you feel uncomfortable, I highly suggest you skip this episode. Now, if you're new in the pews, I'll tell you what is a weekly podcast that shares the weddings, marriages, and romances of Black figures throughout time. Now, we bask on these relationships not to be messy, but to remind you of the passion in our past and to humanize the people we put on pedestals. Basically, it's all love, Black history. And I'm Ashley, your favorite raconteuse that tells you these stories every single Monday. Welcome to the 10th episode of I'll Tell You What. Last week, you'll remember that we discussed Diana Ross and her complicated relationship to her boss, lover, and Motown founder, Berry Gordy. But there were two other men that she loved and married. The first of such was a Jewish man named Robert Ellis Silberstein. Diana met him in 1969. Now, the timing of Robert, or Bob, coming into her life was when Diana and Berry were in a bad place in their relationship. She was looking for a gift for a friend in a department store when she saw him. She went up to him and asked him if he played tennis because he was wearing tennis shorts, and he said, "No, I'm a teacher." They exchanged numbers, which wasn't something that Diana would usually do. I mean, at the time, she was the head of the Supremes and about to go solo, so she was kind of a big deal. Diana asked her fellow Supreme, Cindy Birdsong, the one that replaced Florence Ballard, if she wouldn't mind making their first date a double date with her and her boyfriend, Charles. So they all went to a restaurant in Vegas. Cindy recalled that Diana was very nervous because she had never dated a white guy before, but it actually ended up being a pretty good date, though she didn't continue to date him because she was still dating Berry. Now, many thought that Diana and Berry would end up married, but when that wasn't the case and their relationship was actually ending, she called Bob up and they started dating again. Now, it was known that Bob was a source of happiness for her, and part of that was because he didn't want anything from Diana. He wasn't with her because she was Diana Ross or because it would advance his status, but because he actually liked her. And while some of her coworkers and friends were aware that she had started dating him, she was actually trying to keep this from Berry. But of course, he would find out and asked Diana to actually introduce them. She obliged, and he told her that Bob was a, quote, nice guy, but deep down, he wasn't impressed. So to many people's surprise, on January 20th, 1971, Diana and Bob actually eloped in Vegas at 1 a.m. at the Silver Bells Chapel. She wore a paisley pantsuit and Bob wore a sports jacket and pants. The officiant, Reverend Frank Hutchinson, recalled that, quote, it wasn't particularly romantic between them, but they did seem happy. Nobody from Diana's friends nor family were there except for her best friend and maid of honor and Motown executive, Suzanne DePass. She was also their witness. Now, she promised Diana she would not tell Berry until afterwards, and she made good on that promise. This really caught Berry off guard though, because this was really closing the door on their 5-year relationship, perhaps. Well, about 2 weeks later, Diana would announce that she was expecting their first child, and on August 14th, 1971, she would deliver Ron to Suzanne, a child she would raise with Bob, despite the child's biological father actually being Berry Gordy. But we talked about that last week, and if you missed that, go back and catch up. Well, as she was wrapping filming Lady Sings the Blues, she got pregnant again. Now, of course, this would be Diana's first child with Bob, but they were actually in a unique place in their marriage, or at least that's what was speculated. Now, this was because it was known that Bob was living with her on a part-time basis and rented his own place in the Hollywood Hills. And Diana even hosted his housewarming party. But I, a married woman, personally find this as an example of people needing to mind their own business, because what may work for one person's marriage doesn't necessarily have to work for yours. Diana couldn't even attend the premiere of Lady Sings the Blues, the movie she invested like almost a year of time into, because she was actually very close to her due date. And then 3 days later, on October 15th, 1972, she would give birth to her second daughter and future girlfriend, Tracy Joy. Now, Diana and Bob would be expecting again by the time she was working on her second film, Mahogany. He was in Europe with Diana as she was filming the movie, and by that time, he was no longer teaching, but a publicist going by the name Bob Ellis. This likely allowed him to be with her during that time. But by the end of 1975, before giving birth, Diana was emotionally overwhelmed. She told her husband that she wasn't, quote, happy with her career, her life, or her marriage. And she felt bad because she was feeling this way, though she technically had everything she wanted, which, by the way, is a extremely valid emotion if you thought otherwise. Well, on November 5th, 1975, Bob was definitely a hashtag girl dad when their third daughter, Chutney, was born. Now, biographer J. Randy Taraborelli wrote, quote, one thing that never failed to give her comfort was the fact that Diana knew she was a good mother. She would basically say that there is where she found the most self-confidence. And even in interviews with her children, they would say how their mom was always home and an extremely present parent. Now, despite being a great mom, her marriage was on the rocks by the time that Diana and Bob were on the cover of People magazine in January 1976. And by that summer, she would file for divorce. Diana later told Barbara Walters that one of the problems that he had was always being reduced to being Diana Ross's husband instead of being recognized as an individual outside of who his wife was. Like, at that time, he was also the manager of Shaka Khan and Rufus, like, amongst others. So now, of course, that couldn't have been the only reason why their marriage ended, but I'm sure it didn't help. Bob said once, quote, my wife belongs to that company. She is totally dominated by a man who has never read a book in his life. So needless to say, Barry was a very big part of their problem. Now later, Diana would say that, quote, the pressure of his trying to overcome Barry's importance in my life was too much. You think? Now, it was also known that divorcing Bob was probably one of the biggest regrets in her life. I mean, he was a good man, Diana. Years later, when their daughter Rhonda was 13, Diana would tell her the truth about who her biological father was. And though it was obvious she looked nothing like Bob, he was the one that took care of her, fed her, and loved her like his own. So despite biology, he was always going to be her dad. Now, Bob would marry again later to a woman named Susan. They would open a natural pet food supply store in the late 1980s. And Diana would eventually find love again when she least expected it. Now, after her divorce to Bob Ellis Silberstein, Diana Ross dated a little bit. She had two very prominent relationships, one to actor Ryan O'Neal and the other to Gene Simmons of Kiss. But none of them would be Arna Ness. They met in the summer of 1985 in the Bahamas. Diana was on vacation with her daughters in between recording a new album, and his children ran to her bungalow as a storm came through while they were at the beach. And as a thank you, Arna invited Diana and her daughters to dinner. She was going to decline, but decided to go anyway. It was then that she started to learn more about this man, a Norwegian German named Arna Ness. He was a successful shipping broker, but also enjoyed the outdoors. He was an avid mountain climber. By the time these two met, he had 3 children from a previous marriage. They started to date and were drawn to each other very quickly. On their first date, they went to Jimmy's Tavern in Los Angeles. Diana was so taken by this man that she wanted to introduce him to her bestie Suzanne immediately. Like around 1 a.m. or so, Arna and Diane pulled up to Suzanne's home after she didn't take Diana's call. So Suzanne was like, I can meet him later. It is the middle of the night and I got my pajamas on. Like, girl, if you don't get it. Their whirlwind relationship escalated, and by fall of 1985, they got engaged. But it was actually speculated that they secretly got married at the end of the year. Now, it didn't matter because on February 1st, 1986, they got married in Switzerland. Diana wore a $12,000 quote long white satin and a lace gown with a bodice embroidered with pearls. She also had a 6-foot train. She wore her hair in a low bun, and on the top of her head sat a 250-year-old diamond tiara. And after the ceremony, she wore a quote satin-lined white mink wrap. The reception took place at the Beau Rivage Palace Hotel in Lausanne, and part of the wedding meal consisted of roasted veal, and they had a chocolate wedding cake that they flew in from San Francisco. Now, despite her father being alive, she actually wanted Michael Jackson to give her away, but their relationship had been like a little strained over the years. Diana likely hurt his feelings after commenting on some of his recent plastic surgery. She felt like he was doing a little bit too much, and someone told her that, sis, he's trying to look like you, allegedly. Now, meanwhile, Michael said that he was hurt because Diana never introduced him to Arna, and because also, apparently and allegedly, Michael was in love with Diana secretly, or maybe not secretly, but regardless, not only did he not walk her down the aisle, he also didn't go to the wedding. By spring of 1987, Diana was pregnant with their first child at the age of 43. Now, at the time, her youngest Chutney was 12 years old. And despite having a very, very hard pregnancy, on October 7th, 1987, she had her first son, a little boy named Ross Arna. And the following year, she was pregnant again. On August 26, 1988, she had Evan Olaf, who we would later know as Ant from ATL or Ashley Simpson's husband. Now, many years later, the problems in their marriage will become more and more apparent. Arna wanted her to move to Norway, but Diana didn't want to relocate her daughters, and plus, allegedly, his kids didn't care for her much anyway. So they mostly maintained a very long-distance marriage. Now, they missed each other so much when they were apart, but they just couldn't figure out really how to actually be together. By spring of 1999, Arna would announce that they would be filing for divorce. This would absolutely break Diana's heart because she still wanted to work it out. Almost a year later, by February 2000, their divorce was finalized. Now, the next few years would be kind of rough for Diana. And so about 4 years after their divorce, she would learn that Arna died. He was rappelling down a mountain north of Cape Town when he fell to his death. This happened kind of around the time that she was arrested for a DUI. Apparently, though, his death was like an eye-opener that reminded her that she had so much to live for. And she still does. I mean, like, since then, Diana's performed for President Obama, received a Lifetime Achievement Grammy, had a residency in Vegas, is even touring this year, and she watched her family expand. She's not only the mother of 5 children, but she has 7 grandchildren. So, overall, Miss Ross is doing quite fine. And next, we're going to discuss the love stories of fellow Supreme Mary Wilson. Now, before Mary Wilson of the Supremes was a married woman, she dated many well-known men like Flip Wilson, Steve McQueen, and even Eddie Kendricks of The Temptations. Now, some of these men were married too, but that's not what we're here to talk about. I mean, sorta. Anywho, those relationships weren't as important as the 2 I'm going to tell you about that led up to her marriage to the future manager of the Supremes, Pedro Ferrer. Now, Mary said she started dating a fellow Motown artist in 1964, Abdul Fakir, or Duke. He was a member of the Four Tops, and Mary said that they were known as the, quote, sweethearts of Motown, which was cute if it wasn't for the fact that Duke was still married. Now, well, technically, he was separated from his wife, Inez. Now, though though his separation was common knowledge at Motown, no one really cared. I mean, actually, Mary said Berry Gordy cared more about the fact that she potentially wanted to put mirrors on her ceiling above her bed, more so than the fact that she was in a relationship to a married man. So when Mary moved into her new home off Buena Vista Drive in Detroit, she let Duke move in also. And sometime around then, they actually got engaged. Now, their relationship would continue for about 2 years, but in 1966, Duke wanted to make things right with his wife. He felt like the problems in his marriage were mostly due to the fact that he wasn't making money before, but because he had started to make money now, he felt like it was just only right to return to his wife and their 2 kids. Now, Mary offered to give him $50,000 to stay. But Duke told her, no, don't do that. It's not about the money. Now, Mary wrote that, quote, their schedules were always in conflict and sustaining a relationship with both of us was nearly impossible. Though she understood why he wanted to make it work with his wife, she said it hurt her, quote, deeply. Now, about 8 years later, another guy would captivate her interest. In 1967, a booking agent for the Supremes, this guy named Norman Wise, tried playing matchmaker and told Mary about this singer that she should, quote, get to know. She wasn't interested at first until she saw what he looked like. Now, Mary said she, quote, was impressed by his good looks. She would call this man TJ sometimes, but we would know him as the Welsh singer, Tom Jones. You know, it's not unusual, Tom Jones. Exactly. All right, so Norman set it up for Tom to meet the Supremes, but the real point was to really let him meet Mary. At this point, the Supremes weren't really in a good place personally. Like, Florence had already been kicked out, and then Cindy came in as her replacement, and she was cool with Mary, and I guess Diana too, a little bit, but mostly Diana was like on her own island. She wasn't really trying to prioritize spending time with the other 2 girls, so they didn't really interact with her when they didn't have to. So saying all that to say, Cindy and Mary knew what the point of this was. Diana didn't. And so then they met Tom in the Supremes dressing room, and afterwards Mary and Tom agreed to link up. Now, after bouncing around from various spots, they met back up at the Supremes hotel. She said, quote, I could see instantly that Tom was like no man I'd ever met. And she believed that she, quote, had found her love at last. Later, Mary would get some news to dampen that sentiment. She would learn that Tom was married. Come on, not another married man. So here she was, again, being the mistress to the great married love of her life. She said after her relationship to Duke, she told herself she would not date a married man again, but was way in too deep with Tom. Like, she said that sometimes she would fly into London just to be with him for one night. Girl. And this was like before Sky Miles? Oof. But Mary also knew that she wasn't the only person that Tom was cheating on his wife with. Though she enjoyed their conversation and the time that they would spend together, their relationship was causing her a lot of emotional toil. In late 1968, Mary was visiting her friend, jazz singer Nancy Wilson, at her hotel suite in Vegas. Now, Nancy was getting her hair done by a beautician when Mary came, and so when she wrapped up, Mary was like, hey, can you do my hair as well? So as the beautician is giving Mary a relaxer, it was like that episode of Martin when Gina was helping out at Shanae's salon. That happened to Mary, and it wasn't because the beautician didn't know what she was doing, unlike Gina, but the stress of this relationship was taking her and her scalp down badly. So it would be almost a year later for them to finally just make the decision to end the affair. Though Mary had been down this road before, and that did not make it any easier. Now, Tom would remain married to his childhood sweetheart until she passed away in 2016 from cancer. And Mary would actually find love and a husband at a Future concert. Not a Future concert, but you know what I mean. Mary Wilson of the Supremes met her future husband in Puerto Rico. In early 1973, while performing, Mary spotted a man in the audience that had, quote, deep brown eyes and gorgeous features. He would call her up after the show and they met for drinks in the lobby. She said upon meeting him, he said hi and then French kissed her. Yeah, it threw her off and us as well, while also turning her on. That time, she was dating a man from New Orleans named Freddie. Though she really liked him and even her adopted son Willie did too, she broke it off with him. So this man that she just met, that she was falling for very, very quickly, was named Pedro Ferrer. Now Pedro told her he was a part of this, quote, wealthy, politically powerful Dominican family, had an IQ of 150 and a lot of other things to impress her. They were pretty much inseparable until it was time for her to return. So Pedro would surprise her by popping up in New Jersey a little while later, and then when she would go to England for work, he would surprise her there as well. Well, actually he called her up and was like, hey, I want to come too. Can you book a room for me and my friends? So they continued to pursue a long distance relationship until Pedro came to visit her in June. Mary went to pick him up at the airport only to realize he came with a lot of luggage, read into that as you might, and a Saint Bernard. This man decided to move in without asking. Now he didn't get along with Willie, which definitely irked her, and he was starting to show signs of being a little possessive. And though these very pink flags were turning crimson very fast, and Mary knew this, she excused it because all of this was taking place during a very complicated time in her life. You see, Diana had already gone solo, and Mary was the last remaining original member of the Supremes. She didn't want to let the group go, but was also struggling with how Motown was handling them. And so, though Pedro was somewhat compulsive, controlling, and annoying, he was kind of caring for Mary in a way that no one else was, or at least that's what she was telling herself. Meanwhile, the people in her life were not really seeing it for him. Mary's mama was not here for this relationship at all. Now, what did I say before a few episodes ago? Mamas be knowing. One time, Pedro saw an old picture of Mary with Tom Jones and called her a, quote, effing whore. He then forced her to write down the name of every guy she slept with. Now, Mary wasn't a dummy, so she didn't write down every single person, but the fact that someone that she was engaged to would even ask her such a thing, like, and yeah, you heard that right, engaged, because within a very short time of them dating, they decided to get married. So as they moved along with wedding planning, they had an engagement party at their house with over 200 guests. Some of these guests included Jim Brown, Yvonne Fair, Richard Roundtree, Smokey Robinson, and Lola Falana. Mary said she cooked, quote, black beans, cornbread, and ham hocks. It was a good old time. And they decided to get married at the Riviera Hotel in Las Vegas in 1974. The Supremes were going to share the stage with a performer named Joel Grey at the hotel. Now, when the day came, it was very bittersweet. However, she tried to make the most out of it. She wore a beautiful wedding gown that she said was, quote, made from a Spanish style pattern and trimmed in white lace and pearls. Willie walked her down the aisle. Their entire wedding ceremony and reception was about an hour and a half long as the Supremes were performing that night. But she said, quote, the honeymoon was over almost as soon as it began. Now, not too long after they got married, they were expecting their first child, but this is probably when their marriage became way more intense. In 1974, Mary would deliver a healthy baby girl through a C-section. They named their baby Turquesa, which was inspired by a plant that Pedro got her. So abusers don't usually change once they have a child. He would continue to accuse Mary of cheating on him when the rumor was that he was actually the one doing the cheating. And then there was this other time when Mary wore this kind of like modestly revealing outfit on stage. Now Pedro's response wasn't "you a mom," but instead he beat her and gave her a black eye. All the while her personal life is in shambles, over time Pedro would just assume the role as the manager for the Supremes. Now this would frustrate the other two girls in the group as expected because one, who asked you? And 2, this felt like a very biased arrangement. But 3, they were seeing the bruises that Mary was trying to cover. They hated that man. By 1977, Mary was coming to the conclusion that she needed to get a divorce. Around this time, she was pregnant with their second child. She would deliver on September 29, 1977, a little boy named after his father. Complications would keep her in the hospital for about 2 weeks. And in December of that year, Mary mentioned how one time Pedro came home after being gone all night and immediately asked her who had been at the house with her. He then slapped her in the face and then took a piece and pushed it up against her head. She said, quote, "I felt that if Pedro truly believed I'd been with a man, he would surely unalive me." She also mentioned that this one time in one of these abusive moments, she tracked down a police officer and the cop told her there was nothing he could do because this was a domestic matter. This also was around the time that she was pregnant with their third child. Now, these violent fits led Pedro to slicing off part of Mary's ear with a champagne glass. And by early 1978, she was just going broke. But the birth of her son, Raphael, in 1977 was at least a very brief, happy moment in her life. But I don't know if you know, 7 is the number of completion. The May 7th, 1981 edition of Jet magazine announced that Mary was finally divorcing Pedro after almost 7 years of marriage. So on New Year's Day, 1981, Pedro was served divorce papers. He was absolutely pissed. But Mary was finally getting to the point where she felt free. Still very low on funds, she reached out to an unlikely source to help her with the down payment on a house for her and her children. That unlikely source was Miss Diana Ross, who actually agreed to help her as long as she paid it back with interest. I believe deep down inside, Mary just really wished that they could have rekindled a solid friendship like they had before. I mean, why else would Mary ask Diana to be Turquessa's godmother? And also, why would Diana accept? Now, Mary in life after Pedro would actually go on to thrive. She saw success in her solo career. She worked on Broadway and her babies were doing good. Well, that was until 1994 when she was in the car with her youngest Raphael. They were in a really bad car accident that actually claimed his life. Sadly, he was only 14 years old. Now, I have absolutely no idea what happened to Pedro afterwards, and frankly, but Mary never remarried. She passed away in February 2021 from heart disease. Now, let's wrap this up with a look at Blondie, or rather, Florence Ballard. Now, it might be a surprise to some, but Florence Ballard, or Flo from the Supremes, was actually dating a white guy named Roger Pearson for about a year and a half. Now, they eventually grew apart, and that's when she met the man she would marry, Tommy Chapman. Flo met Tommy at work. He was the chauffeur of Berry Gordy. Now, Tommy and Flo's relationship began as her time with Motown was coming to an end. The day after her birthday in 1967, after they threw her this birthday party literally the night before, Flo was kicked out of the Supremes, mostly due to her attitude, absence, tardiness, and weight gain. But that didn't matter to Tommy though. He didn't see her as a Supreme, he just saw her as Flo. So Tommy proposed to Flo through the phone when he was in San Juan. She said yes, and he quit his job with Motown. They went on and eloped in Hawaii. Now, despite the uncertainty of her career, she let her husband be her business manager as she sought to go solo. Now, Florence got a deal at ABC Records after she signed her Motown settlement where she agreed to $160,000 as long as she never mentioned that she was ever a Supreme. After she put out a record, but the label didn't promote it well, it was glaringly obvious that she shouldn't have given this job to her husband. Due to the lack of success with her record, she was dropped from the label. So around that time, she was expecting twins, and realizing she never received her signing bonus, which was supposed to be $15,000, $15,000, nor did she receive her Motown settlement. She reached out to her attorney. Now, her attorney was this guy, Leonard Bond, who basically yada yada this. So because Florence never saw her money, nor would he hand over her contracts and paperwork from her time at Motown, they felt like he was playing with their money, like literally. So because of all this, she would sue him and file a complaint with the state attorney general's office and the Bar Association, amongst others. She struggled to find a lawyer to take the case, but eventually found counsel at a black law firm. Now, she also went on to sue Motown, but that was thrown out because she couldn't produce the original $160,000 that they gave her. So the stress of this put a strain on her marriage, but also Tommy's career did too. That black law firm that represented her found Tommy a job at this startup record label, Invictus. Now, Flo was upset that he took that job because they were paying him $180 every other week versus this grocery store he was working at paid him $200 every week. Needless to say, all of this was chaotic, but she continued to find some passion within her marriage to Tommy as they had twins, Michelle Denise and Nicole Renee, in the late 1960s, and then a third daughter, Lisa Sabrina, on July 15th, 1972. But it didn't matter because eventually they separated and Flo would file for divorce. Now, Tommy countersued and said she wasn't in her right mind to divorce, which was something that Flo even questioned herself. Eventually, they would get back together. Now, throughout this time, Flo was suffering from depression as her funds were running dry, her husband was barely around, and her career was dead. It got to a point where she wasn't able to pay the mortgage and had to pawn jewelry, but still ended up losing her house. And Tommy had gotten laid off at Invictus, so the only thing he could do was help out with food from time to time. Now, after the foreclosure, Flo and her 3 daughters moved in with her sister and her 5 kids. Flo and Tommy decided, you know what, let's try to get back together, but because of their respective living situations, they couldn't live in one home. Now, she would turn to drinking even heavier than before. Now, when she was in the Supremes and was drinking, many felt like she was coping with the physical and emotional trauma from what happened to her when she was a teenager. She went to a sock hop with her brother, but actually kind of lost him in the crowd. A guy she knew growing up, this guy named Reggie Harding, that was like this popular basketball player in the area, was like, hey, I'll take you home. But instead, he pulled over into an alley and ape-raped her. Now, this assault took her virginity. So that, plus the fact that he then went on to have a career with the Pistons, probably just a lot of trauma for a teenage girl. So then fast forward to that, on top of losing her job, going broke, ending her marriage, losing her home, and just being at the very bottom. It's just like, whew, that's just so much. In 1974, she was admitted into the psychiatry department at Henry Ford Hospital. So when she got out, Mary Wilson's mom reached out and was like, hey, you and the girls can move in with me and just take your time. And that helped her out for a little bit. After Tommy stopped paying child support, she got on welfare. Now, because she was on welfare, the Detroit Free Press ran an article about her, which did bring her some national attention briefly because a lot of people had no idea what was going on with Florence. They thought that she was doing fine, she was living off her millions, but no, that wasn't the reality. And Mary had even reached out because Mary was always reaching out and checking on her and the girls and offered her a job at Motown again, and she refused because at that point she hated Motown. Now, she eventually started reading the Bible again, and then that gave her some solace, and it seemed like things were starting to finally turn around for her. Her ex-lawyer called to settle. She received $82,000 and was able to keep $62,000, and her ex-lawyer's law partner also ended up giving her $10,000. It at least allowed her to be able to get a place for her, Tommy, and the kids. In winter 1976, Flo was found on the floor of her home and unable to move. He took her to the hospital where they discovered she had a blood clot in her artery. Now, the doctors were hopeful, but sadly, on February 22nd, 1976, Florence Ballard passed away at the age of 32 due to coronary artery thrombosis. Tommy planned her funeral, which was performed by Reverend C.L. Franklin, aka Aretha's daddy. Thousands of people showed up despite them changing the details of the funeral at the last minute. Now, years later, Tommy would pass away in his sleep due to a heart attack. Now, the 3 original Supremes had so much life and so much more of their story that I wasn't able able to include. Now, if you're interested in learning more about any of the people and stories I shared this week, definitely read Diana Ross, a biography by J. Randy Taraborelli, The Supremes, a saga of Motown, Dream, Success, and Betrayal by Mark Ribowski, Dream Girl and Supreme Faith, My Life as a Supreme by Mary Wilson, The Lost Supreme, The Life of Dream Girl Florence Ballard by Peter Benjaminson. Now, the links to these books and other articles I used in my research are in the notes below. All right, y'all. As always, don't forget to subscribe and follow us everywhere. If you enjoy listening to your podcast instead of watching, subscribe to I'll Tell You What wherever you listen. And don't forget to leave us a review. Now, some of you have asked how to support the show, so you can definitely do so by going to I'llTell.com to grab some merch. Or you could purchase a book or something off the I'll Tell You What Amazon wish list to help me with my research. And if you want to reach me, my email is Hueido.com. You can find me at Demitosh on Instagram, Threads, Twitter, and TikTok. And I'm at Ashley on Spill. Now come back as we keep this Motown matrimonies train rolling, because we're going to be looking at some more folks, including Marvin Gaye. I'll see you in the pews.